Many tears were shed on a night when West Ham United waved goodbye to Upton Park and the Bowling Ground after 112 years of calling this particular corner of East London home. Having played thousands of matches and recorded more unforgettable moments than you could shake a claret and blue stick at, the very last competitive fixture to be staged in Green Street would take place against the team which, barring West Ham itself, features most on our countdown: Manchester United. For many thousands of supporters, celebrations began early, with Green Street and the Barking Road, the scene of many triumphant episodes over the years, beginning to fill up from lunchtime. By the time the visiting team bus arrived, the streets and local hostelries surrounding the ground were packed to the rafters by West Ham fans hoping to participate in the festivities, including many without a ticket for the match who had attended just so that they could say, "I was there." This resulted in one or two issues for the coach driver, but Manchester United were nonetheless ready to go by the time the allotted kick-off time arrived. The club, having planned a post-match event to mark the end of West Ham's association with the Bowling Ground, hoped that the team could mark the day with a win, which would also provide a fitting finish to what had been a highly successful 2015-16 campaign, in which the club had reached the quarter-finals of the FA Cup and consistently challenged the Premier League's best. After a marching band had got the evening off to a fitting start, Diafra Sakho provided the match's opening goal with just 10 minutes on the clock. 1-0 ahead at the break, it might have been 2 had Michail Antonio's effort not been controversially ruled out. West Ham were pegged back 5 minutes after the restart when Anthony Martial levelled the scores, before the French forward added a second with just 17 minutes remaining, thus threatening to put a dampener on the entire day. Yet there was no way Slaven Bilic's men were going to lose this one, and it took just 4 minutes for Antonio to head home the equaliser from Dimitri Payet's cross. West Ham fans have always loved a maverick, and so it was perhaps fitting that Payet provided the cross for the goal that was to secure the win, which was converted by Winston Reid, who therefore became the final player to score at the stadium. The final whistle was greeted by jubilant scenes, and the entire post-match production broadcast live on TV for the benefit of the tens of thousands of fans who had been unable to secure a ticket to the match. And there wasn't a dry eye in the house when the club's greatest ever player, Bobby Moore, returned to the ground one last time to switch off the lights. It had been some 41 years since West Ham United had appeared in an FA Cup final proper, the first ever staged at Wembley. In March 1964, Ron Greenwood's Hammers were on the cusp of returning to the Twin Towers, but faced a stiff hurdle in the shape of the mighty Manchester United in an FA Cup semi-final at Hillsborough. The clear underdogs, Greenwood's side, were up against the reigning cup holders, who had beaten Leicester 3-1 in the previous year's final. Matt Busby's New Babes, who had beaten West Ham 2-0 at the Bowling Ground just 7 days earlier in a League Division 1 fixture, had also been beaten finalists twice in the preceding decade. In front of a capacity crowd of some 65,000 and on a pitch that loosely resembled a muddy swamp, the Hammers, bedecked in their chain strip of light blue and claret hoops, proved more than a match for the Red Devils, although a tentative first half failed to produce a single goal. While Ron Greenwood's side had exerted the greater pressure and did well to contain their opponents, thanks in no small part to a Herculean performance from Bobby Moore, it was the United of Manchester who went closest to breaking the deadlock when Georgie Best's dipping drive clipped Jim Standon's crossbar. However, the game burst into life 11 minutes after the restart, when Ronnie Boyce put the Hammers ahead with a 25-yard drive that left Manchester United keeper David Gaskell grasping at thin air. 7 minutes later, Ticker doubled the Irons' lead and his own personal tally when converting a quickly taken corner. Dennis Law gave Manchester hope with 12 minutes remaining when he nodded home from inside the 6-yard box, but Jeff Hurst clinched the win for West Ham 10 minutes from time when he beat Gaskell in the same corner as Boyce had when opening the scoring earlier in the half. So it was that West Ham were back at Wembley for the first time since winning the FA War Cup in 1940, where the tables would be turned and it was the Hammers who would be favourites this time against second division Preston North End. Prior to the beginning of the 1985-86 season, the closest West Ham had got to winning the Division 1 title had been a couple of fifth-placed finishes in the 1960s. But that was all set to change as John Lyall's side pushed the two Merseyside giants of Liverpool and Everton all the way before reluctantly relinquishing their unlikely claim to the title in the final week of the season. Ironically, perhaps, the season couldn't really have started in worse fashion. Paul Allen, the former Terrace favourite who had moved everyone with his tears following the 1980 FA Cup final, had joined Tottenham after refusing to sign a new deal at West Ham, while Paul Goddard's season had been wrecked by a shoulder injury in the first game of the season, a defeat at Birmingham. However, Goddard's misery was to be to Frank McAvenny's considerable gain. Signed along with Mark Ward at the beginning of the campaign, the Scot formed a lethal partnership with a young Tony Cottee that saw the pair go on to net an incredible 52 goals between them that season. Yet one win from their opening 7 games had left West Ham teetering on the edge of the relegation zone. Consequently, a First League Championship was far from the minds of anyone connected with the club come mid-September. However, something extraordinary then happened as the Hammers went on an incredible run of 18 league games without defeat, a sequence that was to finally end at Tottenham on Boxing Day more than 3 months later, with West Ham up to third in the Cannon League Division 1. With 3 more defeats in the next 5 fixtures, played out over the course of nearly 3 months due to an appalling winter, Lyall's side slipped to 7th. But just 2 defeats in the following 12 outings meant the Hammers went into the penultimate game of the season in 2nd place, right behind leaders Liverpool. A 3-2 win at West Brom gave cause for hope, but Liverpool's 1-0 win at Chelsea, who had also been in with a shout of the title and were thumped 4-0 at Stamford Bridge by West Ham in one of the season's most memorable matches, meant that the title would return to Merseyside. The final game of the season at Everton was therefore a playoff for the runners-up spot, with the Hammers only needing a draw to claim it. But a 3-1 reversal resulted in a 1-2 for the City of Liverpool. Despite that minor hiccup at the last hurdle, it had been a wonderful season for West Ham and the boys of '86, the likes of which has never been repeated. Prior to the meeting between Division 2's West Ham United and Division 1's Bolton Wanderers at the Empire Stadium in 1923, the Football Association had staged the cup final at a series of venues, mostly in the capital, although Manchester's Fallowfield Stadium and Derby's Racecourse Ground were just 2 of a number of venues that had also been used. Chelsea's Stamford Bridge had hosted the last finals before Wembley took over in 1923. Sir Robert McAlpine had initially been charged with building a stadium for the 1924 British Empire Exhibition. Like the Olympic Stadium in Stratford, West Ham's current venue for home matches, the Empire Stadium was originally scheduled for demolition after the exhibition, but was eventually saved by civil servant James Stevenson. Completed just 4 days before the final was due to be played, the new stadium's capacity was 127,000. But even then, the organisers had grossly underestimated interest in the match. The FA, who had chosen not to implement ticket sales, were totally unprepared for the estimated 300,000 people who congregated in northwest London for the game, the vast majority of whom were Londoners, with many having walked the 26 miles or so from the East End. As a result of the swollen crowd, the match was under serious threat of not proceeding at one stage. The decision was therefore taken to call upon police horses to restore order, and it was one of those horses, PC George Scory's Mount Billy, which stole the headlines as his white coat stood out in the following day's black and white photos amongst the mass of dark overcoats and flat caps. West Ham had reached the final by virtue of wins against Hull, Brighton, Plymouth, Southampton and, in the semi-final, Derby. Sadly, the final itself was to prove a major disappointment for Hammers supporters who watched their side go down 2-0 on the day, once the playing area had been cleared, as Bolton won through goals from David Jack and Jack Smith. The match, for which the official attendance remains 126,047, is widely recognised as having the biggest crowd for a sporting event in history, outside of a racing event, and is a record that is unlikely to ever be beaten. West Ham United's 1976 Cup Winners' Cup semi-final second leg against crack German outfit Eintracht Frankfurt on the 14th of March 1976 is widely considered to be the greatest game ever to take place at the Bowling Ground. When supporters talk about memorable performances under the lights at Upton Park, this is the match from which such references first hailed. An eventful first leg had seen the Germans, who had won every game in the tournament, both home and away prior to the second leg at Upton Park, snatch a narrow victory. Despite Graham Paddon granting West Ham an early lead with an absolute belter inside the opening 10 minutes, beating the unfortunately named Peter Kunter inside his near post, goals from Woody Neuberger and Wolfgang Kraus had given Die Adler a lead to defend, albeit slender, when visiting London a fortnight later. Minus leading goalscorer Alan Taylor, who missed both ties with knee ligament damage, West Ham failed to break down a dogged German defence in the first half of the second leg and were forced to survive one or two major scares of their own. But the Bowling Ground erupted just 4 minutes after the restart, when Frank Lampard's far post cross was converted by the head of Trevor Brooking, a feat he would repeat 4 years later at Wembley in another huge match in the club's history. Frankfurt responded strongly, producing wave after wave of attacks. Meanwhile, the Hammers were more than a touch fortunate not to concede a penalty for what appeared to be a clear handball.
Oh no! Benson again, no! And no penalty given!
But United stood strong and eventually doubled their lead on the night when Keith Robson scored a screamer with 23 minutes of normal time remaining.
Oh, but a great goal! Keith Robson!
Trevor Brooking, perhaps enjoying the greatest night of his career in Upton Park, put West Ham 3-0 ahead on the night and 4-2 up on aggregate on 78 minutes with a quite wonderful goal as he turned the Frankfurt defence inside out before squeezing his shot home to send a bowl-in packed with almost 40,000 people into ecstasy.
Still Brooking! Yes, number 3!
But with victory in their grasp and just 3 minutes of normal time remaining, Klaus Beverungen found the net to make it 3-1 on the night, meaning that just one more goal for the Germans would send them through to the final on away goals. So it was that for the final 3 minutes many fingernails were bitten as Frankfurt piled forward, while desperate defending was the order of the day for West Ham. But by hook or by crook, the Hammers held out to win 4-3 on aggregate and secure passage through to the final in Belgium's Heysel Stadium against Anderlecht.
It's all over, and West Ham are through to the final. 4-3 on aggregate, and 3-1 tonight after a brilliant attacking performance by them. None greater than Trevor Brooking, who scored the 2 goals, one with his head and one with his foot.
Somewhat earlier in this countdown, we featured Alan Taylor's outstanding performances in an unforgettable FA Cup run, during which the 21-year-old scored a brace in each of the final 3 rounds to see John Lyall's team to glory. His 2 goals against Arsenal at Highbury in the last 8 sent West Ham through to a semi-final against a much-fancied Ipswich Town team led by Bobby Robson, who would go on to enjoy success on both domestic and European stages within 5 years. Following a goalless draw in the first encounter, Sparrow grabbed another pair as West Ham triumphed 2-1 in the replay to send the Hammers through to the final for the first time since 1964, 11 years earlier. Awaiting them at Wembley were Second Division Fulham, who had already knocked West Ham out of the League Cup earlier that season. A 2-1 defeat that was otherwise notable for floodlight failure, which led to a cessation of play for some 30 minutes before the restoration of power to 3 pylons allowed play to continue. Adding a unique twist to the final was the inclusion of West Ham legend Bobby Moore in the Fulham side, for Moore had moved across London 14 months earlier, having lost his place at West Ham to Mick McGivern. A planned move to Brian Clough's Derby in late 1973 had been curtailed by Ron Greenwood, who told Moore he could have a free transfer should he remain at West Ham until they were safe from relegation that season. It was therefore a strange sight that greeted Hammers fans arriving at Wembley on the day, to see their greatest player ever preparing to pit his wits against the club that he had previously spent his entire footballing career with. Moore, even though he had gained a few pounds since his heyday, gave an exemplary performance, yet still couldn't prevent his side from falling to defeat. Taylor, who less than a year before the final had been plying his trade at Rochdale, opened the scoring against the run of play with an hour on the clock after Peter Mellor spilled Billy Jennings' shot.
Mellor gets it. Taylor turns it back. Yes! Alan Taylor! 1-0 to West Ham.
3 minutes later, Mellor gaffed again, this time failing to hold Graham Paddon's drive, and Taylor was on hand to bundle the ball home.
And hit well by Paddon, number 2. And he's done it again. Alan Taylor. Lampard. Again a look at his watch by referee Pat Partridge. A sign from both his linesmen that the time is up. And West Ham have won the cup, and Alan Taylor's 2 goals have done it.
Before accepting the coveted trophy and immediately following the final whistle, West Ham's new captain Billy Bonds made a beeline for Moore, who he warmly embraced before climbing the 39 steps to lift the trophy for West Ham for the first time since Bobby had stood in the same spot 11 years before.
For West Ham, receiving the cup from His Royal Highness the Duke of Kent.
Having seen off the challenge of the vastly experienced Manchester United in the semi-final, some of West Ham's players could perhaps have been forgiven for thinking that they already had one hand on the cup when it was ascertained that they would be facing second division side Preston North End in the final, West Ham's first FA Cup final since the 1923 defeat against Bolton Wanderers, and their first appearance at the Twin Towers since defeating Blackburn Rovers in the FA War Cup in 1940. However, by the time half-time arrived in the Wembley showpiece, there could have been no doubt as to the true size of the task that awaited Ron Greenwood's side if they were to win the cup for the first time in the club's history, as expected prior to kick-off. Despite being a division below the Hammers, the Lily-Whites went into the break 2-1 ahead after goals from Holden on 10 minutes and Dawson 5 minutes before the interval had given the Lancashire outfit a narrow advantage. West Ham, comprehensively outplayed in the opening 45 minutes, had however managed to score once through Johnny Sissons, who at only 18 was the team's youngest member. And it was that goal that was to eventually prove pivotal for United to ultimately emerge victorious. Having taken the opportunity to regroup at the break, West Ham came out for the second half a different side, and they were back on level terms after only their second attack. A well-worked Peter Braybrook corner was nodded towards goal by Ken Brown and then headed against the crossbar by Jeff Hurst. Lady Luck smiled upon the Hammers and the ball hit North End's unfortunate keeper Alan Kelly on the way out and trickled back over the line to restore parity in the tie. Still, Preston were far from finished. Spurred on by Howard Kendall, at 17 the youngest player to feature in an FA Cup final at that point, the Lancashire side, who recorded 16 shots to West Ham's 13 on the day, went close to regaining the lead on several occasions. But in the end, all their efforts were to be in vain, when, with the match seconds away from the final whistle, Ronnie Boyce stepped up to head home the winning goal, and one that clinched the FA Cup for West Ham United for the first time ever.
Can he do it in the dying seconds? Braybrook, are we going to have a sensational ending? Yes, we are! It's a goal, and that must be the winner! That must be the winner. Boyce has got it, and there can only be seconds left for play as Byrne doing somersaults.
Whether we like it or not, the 1966 World Cup final and West Ham United is, and always will be, intrinsically linked. All 4 goals on the day were scored by Hammers, one of whom remains the only player to score 3 times in a World Cup final, another achievement unique to West Ham United, and it was the claret and blue triumvirate of Bobby Moore, Jeff Hurst and Martin Peters who contributed 3 assists and the captain of the team. It was a quite extraordinary achievement for a club which, only 7 years earlier, had returned to Division 1, having spent 27 years languishing in the nation's second tier. Nobby Styles' joyous jig, Jeff Hurst's hat-trick, 2 goals of which were born on training pitches at Chadwell Heath, Kenneth Wolstenholme's legendary commentary, "They think it's all over, it is now," and England's "did it or didn't it cross the line" 3rd goal, which has led to countless debates since, were particular highlights from a day that remains unequalled in English football, an event that is still widely celebrated and often hailed as the nation's single greatest sporting achievement.
It's all over, I think. No.
When there was only a minute to go, England still had no thought of being content with that 1-goal lead.
And people are on the pitch, they think it's all over. It is now.
Yet one moment stood out above all others, as Barking and West Ham's very own Bobby Moore, captain of his victorious country, climbed the 39 steps to accept the Jules Rimet Trophy from Queen Elizabeth II, having led his team to a 4-2 extra-time defeat of arch-rivals West Germany. Moore paused briefly to wipe the sweat from his hands prior to shaking the monarch's gloved hand and accepting the Golden Cup. It was a touch of class that spoke volumes about Moore, a man of dignity and honour, who finally lifted the trophy, therefore becoming the only Englishman ever to do so. No single club has ever made such a notable contribution to a World Cup final winning team, and no other English club is likely to ever do so. It is said many a true word is spoken in jest, which absolutely applies when West Ham fans maintain that it was the Irons who won the World Cup final in 1966. Quite why it is so remains a mystery, but West Ham United often manage to produce their very best when the odds are firmly stacked against them. Never was that oddity more apparent than on the 10th of May 1980, when the Hammers went head-to-head with First Division Arsenal in the FA Cup final. An indifferent final third of the 1979-80 Division 2 league campaign, which produced just 4 wins from 15 games, had left John Lyall's side facing a 3rd successive season outside of the top flight. In stark contrast, and partly culpable for that inconsistent league form, had been the Irons' success in the 2 domestic cup competitions that resulted in West Ham reaching the quarter-finals of the League Cup plus the FA Cup final, courtesy of wins against West Bromwich Albion, Leyton Orient, Swansea City, Aston Villa and, in the semi-final, Everton. It was the first time West Ham had ever reached the last 8 of both competitions in the same season. Long before the introduction of modern counter-attacking tactical systems, John Lyall played a masterstroke in opting to feature David Cross as a lone striker. It was a policy that served to confuse Arsenal's purportedly superior team, who, despite enjoying long spells of possession, often found themselves unable to find the gaps that a more familiar 4-4-2 system would have allowed. The only goal of the game was to arrive after just 13 minutes, through the most unlikely of sources, Trevor Brookings' head. While renowned for his silky skills and uncanny ability to pick out a teammate almost instantaneously, Brookings' only previous headed goal of note had come 4 years earlier against Eintracht Frankfurt in the second leg of the semi-final in the Cup Winners' Cup. This time he ducked to convert Stuart Pearson's cross-cum shot from inside the 6-yard box to score what would prove to be the most valuable goal of his entire career. And so it was, for the second time in 6 years, Billy Bonds lifted the trophy in front of thousands of delirious Hammers fans.
For West Ham.
Meanwhile, Paul Allen, who became the youngest player ever to feature in an FA Cup final, was left in tears at the final whistle. And not just because of Willie Young's disgraceful professional foul 3 minutes from time, when the youngster was free on goal with just Pat Jennings to beat. A foul which was rewarded with just a yellow card.
You've done such a great job for us for a lot of years. What you've done for us today is incredible. I didn't think probably yesterday could be matched by anything in terms of our club. But what you've done today, you might just have nicked the glory off us. From all the lads, We're delighted you've had a great day yesterday. Thanks for all you do for us. You know how much we care for you. And I know I echo the sentiments of all the lads. Thanks for all you've done for us this year, and I hope next year to be here again talking to you. Thanks.
Before we move on to the number one spot, a couple of statistics for you to chew over. Beginning with, and barring West Ham United, the most referred to teams in our top 100 countdown.
Will it count? Yes, it does count!
And while every decade barring the 1910s, which was interrupted by the Great War, is represented in our list, the decades which crop up most in the countdown are as follows. And so, without further ado, let's find out what is the greatest moment in West Ham United's long and illustrious history. West Ham United Football Club and the Empire Stadium have shared some wonderful moments over the years. It was the Hammers who featured in the first FA Cup final held at the iconic new arena way back in 1923, followed by FA Cup final appearances in 1964, 1975 and 1980. It was the scene of England's sole World Cup triumph back in 1966, in which West Ham's Bobby Moore captained Alf Ramsey's team and fellow Hammers Geoff Hurst and Martin Peters provided the goals. But it was yet another appearance at the famous old Twin Towers that was sadly demolished in 2000 to make way for a new state-of-the-art stadium that provided the backdrop for West Ham United's greatest moment in the club's history. Having firmly stamped his authority on the team following his appointment as successor to the departing Ted Fenton in 1961, Ron Greenwood already had one trophy, or two if you count the Charity Shield that had been shared with Liverpool, under his belt by the time his side returned to Wembley for a second time in 12 months in May 1965. It was that FA Cup win against Preston North End a year earlier that resulted in United's participation in the Cup Winners' Cup competition for the first time, and an opportunity they took full advantage of by reaching the final at the first attempt. Wins against Le Gantois, Spartak Prague, Lausanne and Real Zaragoza had granted West Ham the opportunity to face German side TSV Munich in the final. The home advantage of playing at Wembley was to be of considerable benefit, as Hammers fans easily outnumbered supporters of the team from the Bavarian capital city. Although Jim Standen had to be at his very best on the night to deny 1860 on at least 3 occasions when he found himself left one-on-one with an opponent, Munich's self-appointed best goalkeeper in the world, Peter Radi Radenkovic, was equal to anything the West Ham number 1 could produce. Time after time he denied the Hammers, who were always on top but unable to make the vital breakthrough. That was until Alan Seeley, a part-time first-team player who made only 21 appearances in all competitions that season and had scored the last of his 3 previous goals of the campaign more than 3 months earlier, scored the game's opening goal with 69 minutes on the clock. Ronnie Boyce, who had hit the post earlier in the half, stole the ball in midfield before squaring it to outside right Seeley, who fired home from an acute angle. 2 minutes later, and Seeley, who had married fiancée Barbara just 1 week before the final took place, scored his second of the night when slotting home from close range after Martin Peters had failed to connect with a well-rehearsed free kick. A delivery not dissimilar to that from which Hurst scored in the World Cup final a year later. Johnny Sissons could have added a third late on, but his thunderous effort crashed back off the crossbar to safety, with Radenkovic well beaten once again. Meanwhile, the outstanding Brian Deere, who had been denied a number of times, also saw a late effort chalked off for offside. Fortunately, neither effort mattered, as Bobby Moore went on to lift the trophy and become the first Englishman to do so. It was an achievement that the club have failed to match since, and, after all these years, the kind of performance that has rarely been equalled by any English team.
Bobby Moore plays for West Ham, he plays for England, never seems to take a day off, just came back from the England tour on Monday. And here he is at Wembley playing another match in the European Cup in his cup final, and he's won it. Who knows? Just over a year's time he might be standing on the same spot with the World Cup in his hands.